Hello everyone, welcome to this game of the day analysis from the candidate tournament, the round 9 to be exact, between Anish Giri today and Wang Hao. So if you looked at the complicated game yesterday from the game Caruana against MVL, this one is clearly easier to understand, so it was a smoother win than yesterday, so I hope you will enjoy the game. And let's see how it started. So first, Anish Giri is playing with e4, with d4, knight f6 and c4. So it's quite a usual choice for him. He plays both e4 and d4. I mean, he can play anyway, he can play anything. And as usual, or as it's quite usual, Black is intending to play the Nimzo-Indian, but it's quite rare that White allows it on the previous move, and it's quite unusual now that he goes knight c3, or let's say it's less usual in high-level games. Nobody really wants to play against the Nimzo-Indian, so it's not a surprise to see that Anish is playing with knight f3. So that's the moment where Wang Hao decides to come back to Queen's Gambit with d5. But Anish Giri is choosing the Catalan variation, which he has been doing several times in the previous years, so it's also not a surprise. Both players have played this variation quite sometimes, as we will see. So here Wang Hao goes for the main line with d takes e4. So White has to find a way to take his pawn back, and as he's doing most of the time, Anish has decided to start with queen to c2. He sometimes go with queen a4 with some little differences, but for this game he's preferring the other main line, queen c2. So Wang Hao is playing a6, so he's willing to play b5 in case of queen takes d4. And this variation is playable as also for White, of course, but it's known to be more active, at least for Black, and he is going to try to play for something like knight c6, knight b4 followed with c5. There is this kind of variation that are possible, and if you manage to do the c5 breakthrough, then it's probably going to be around equal. So Anish Giri is choosing a line more positional with a4. He's willing to prevent b7, b5, and to leave Black with less space and some kind of small positional advantage for White. He has done it lots of time in the past, so it's still not a surprise. So Wang Hao places his bishop on this long diagonal anyway, so as he can't go for the b7 square, he decides to go for the c6 square. And here there are two main lines. There is bishop to g5, or there is bishop to f4. So previously Anish has played bishop g5, for example recently on the internet in the previous year he played against Jan Nepomniachtchi. He played with knight c3 and then followed with bishop takes f6, so he's not willing to keep the bishop there. He wants to keep the knights because he believes that knights are stronger in this position, with some player on the queen side. Nevertheless, Nepomniachtchi managed to get a draw in this game. I think it was more a choice. This bishop g5 move was maybe a choice for Anish to not to show his real prep on the Catalan, because I think he played bishop f4 in his more serious games, let's say. So he's playing bishop f4. It's not really the same spirit. He doesn't want to give up the bishop pair by playing bishop takes f6. He wants to keep some pressure against c7, for example, and to have a good control over the most important square, the square on e5, which is one of the most important squares in the position. So, as usual for him, Wang Hao is playing bishop to d6, a5 was another main variation, and here both players have reached this position in the past. Wang Hao always faced queen c1, and also Anish always played queen c1. So with a bad result for Anish Giri, because he lost a few years ago against Vladimir Kramnik in the Stavanger tournament 2014, and he lost after queen c1 and some dangerous attack by black. After rook d1, queen e8, Kramnik was starting an unusual plan, let's say, with bishop c3 knight e4 followed with f5. That was the point of the move queen e8 a few moves earlier. He's willing to bring the queen toward h5 with some play after knight f6, some play on the king side, and of course the pawn structure is very strange for black. It seems really weak, but it's not the most important thing in the position. He wants to have an attack on the king side, and he's going to get it very soon. So it was better for black, and Kramnik eventually won. So instead, for this game, Anish Giri has chosen knight to c3, which is not the main line, but as we will see, it has been played by strong players earlier. This is a very natural move. He's just willing to leave the bishop on f4, and for some reason, the pawn structure is a bit unusual with the pawn on f4, the doubled f pawn, but it provides white with great control over the center. He has full control, especially over the e5 square once again. So he will be able to bring a knight there, which will basically be untouchable. So it can be quite unpleasant to play. Normally it's okay for black, but it can be quite unpleasant to play. And as we will see, Anish is coming with an idea. So Wang Hao decided to go for a5. This is also a natural line. First of all, he is willing to get this square on b4, and he is willing to bring the knight there. So he places a pawn on a5 to control b4, and he allows the knight to come here. And also, if he was going with knight b7, then white is able to go a5, for example, preventing knight b6, and most probably in the next moves going to play b4, b5, with some play on the queen side. So let's, sorry. So with some play coming on the queen side, and probably white has to be better here. So usually black is going for a5, e3, just defending the center, knight a6, and here there was a high-level game between Wesley So and David Navarre a few years ago, where Wesley played with king h1. So in the current game, Anish Giri is going to try to improve over this game. That's what I think. He's going to try to get a better version of this game. So in this game, after king h1, knight b4, queen e2, David Navarre played b6, rook to g1, and we see the white's point of the previous moves. He is bringing the rook toward g1 to have some play on the g file. He's basically willing to trade the light squared bishops, and then double the rooks on the g file and have some kind of an attack on the king side. So in the game, David Navarre played queen c8, which was maybe not the most accurate way to play the position, and after knight e5, takes, and c5, Wesley So kept some play after knight b5. He was still better, and he eventually won this game with a later h4, h5 to come, and there is an attack on g6. It's still playable, of course, for black, but probably the best way to play was to play with rook to c8. To do the same thing, but with the rook on c8 instead of the queen. This is probably stronger because the queen has something to do on the king side to protect everything, and also the rook is just stronger on the c file than on a8. So according to the computer, the position is double-edged, and probably around equal objectively Still not so pleasant to play for black, but very playable. So instead, Anish Giri has played knight e5 very quickly. Wang Hao took on g2. It doesn't really has a choice. King takes c6. And here Anish arrives with a new move, a novelty. He played h3. So it may not be so easy to understand this move h2, h3, because it's not like he is willing to prevent knight g4 or to play knight g4 himself. I don't think the knight has anything to do on g4. Anyway, black is not going to trade on g4 and to help white secure a great pawn structure. So I don't think knight g4 is the idea. I think the point of h3 is only to bring the king on h2. So for example, after queen c7 that he didn't play in the game, I think king h2, rook d8 and rook g1, and we simply prefer with white having the king on h2 than having it on h1, because for some reason it's more exposed on this diagonal, and also it prevents some knight g4 maybe later. There is no problem with the king on this diagonal. It's quite unlikely that the diagonal on where the queen is going to open in the next moves. So the king is probably just safer on h2. That's basically his idea, and that's why he's going for h3, or at least that's what I understand of this move. But we will never know, because in the game he had to do things differently. So after queen b6, the queen is attacking the pawn on b2, of course. So the queen has to come back on e2 to protect it, and also it brings the queens back to the king side, so some ideas on the king side. And here Wang Hao played c5. It's easy for a computer or for someone using a computer to criticize this move of c5, because basically it's clearly weakening the square on g5, on b5, sorry. So the pawn was protecting it from c6, but it's no longer true. So you have some possibilities with white to go, especially queen to b5, intending to swap queens off the board. So it's hard to say, because positionally it's not a great move objectively, but also, as we will see, it was not easy to do nothing, and c5 is trying to do something. He's trying to open the center. Because if he doesn't play c5, if he goes, for example, knight b4, then king h2 once again. That's what I think. And for example, I investigated knight to d5, which looks very natural. And once again, rook g8, rook g1, sorry, rook a d8, rook g5, with some play coming against g6, because he will have to play g6. And h4 immediately, and there will be possibilities of h5 takes and then some sacrifices on g6. That's why here, for example, taking on c3 is already losing for black, because we would take back with the pawn, queen takes, and h5, and black is hopeless. Something like h takes, h, queen to f3, and it will be impossible to prevent knight g6. In the next move, the black king is so alone that he won't survive in this middle game. So taking on c3 a few moves earlier was a mistake. So it should probably come back to e7, but then the position is just very passive. So something like h5, king g7, queen c2, and it seems like it's still holding, but it's really unpleasant for black. I think it was very natural to try to do something on the center before an attack is coming on the king side. And that's my explanation of the move c5, which is condemned then by computers, but from a human point of view, I really feel it's very logical. So with c5 coming, the center is opening, so it's not like Giri is able to have his attack anymore, because it would be too slow to go king h2 and g1. So instead, he played rook d1, c takes d4, takes rook d8. So the center has opened, but not in a great way for black, let's say, because he has less active pieces. And after rook takes d8, one problem is he can't really take back with the rook. He had to take back with the queen, because if he does with the rook, then queen b5 is a very strong move. Because if you take the queen on b5, then a takes b5, attacking the knight on a6 and the pawn on a5 with the rook. So it's already losing at least one pawn for black, and he has a very close to losing position. And after queen c7, if he doesn't want to trade, he has to do queen c7, then knight c4. And the threat is to take on a5, either from the knight or the queen, winning a pawn, and it's impossible to defend it with black. So it would be immediately winning a pawn with white if black takes back with the rook. So he had to take back with the queen. Unfortunately, rook to d1 is so logical, so easy. And here he went queen a8. It looks very strange, but it's one of the only way to keep the pawn on a5 under protection. That's why he went there. If he goes queen c7, here, then queen b5, knight c5, and knight c4 would be a bad surprise again for black. He has to go rook a8 to protect the pawn on a5, and then queen b6 is just so unpleasant to play. It might be still holding for black. He's not losing any pawns this time, but he's definitely going to suffer without any counterplay. So instead he went queen to a8, king to g1, because you don't want to see something like d5 happening with check. So the king went to g1. Knight b4, finally coming to the weak square, queen to b5. He's trading a pair of knights, and in the resulting position, it's still equal material, but white's pieces are so more active than black's that it seems so hard to defend. So, but still it's holdable. But as we will see with some very hard to find moves. So queen d7 is coming. So you can't move the rook on f8 because you have to keep the pawn on f7 protected. You can't also really move the queen anywhere because you also have to defend the pawn on b7. So he played the knight, he played knight f6. Instead, probably knight to b6 was maybe the way to hold for black. It's really hard, but it may have been the way to do it. And for example, queen c7, then you come back to d5, just harassing the queen. Queen d7, knight b6, queen d6 is another try, but then queen d8 is holding. It's a really hard move, I think, but this seems to hold after rook c7, attacking both pawns, and then only f6, rook takes, attacking the knight, and knight takes should be still around equal. So Wang Hao would have probably been able to escape in that position. Instead, knight f6 was seen in the game, queen d6, and here comes a probably decisive mistake. He played g6, which is too passive and too weakening for the queen side. It's so easy to say it at home, but this is quite a usual, natural move to go king g7 on the next move. But it's just too weakening for black. So instead, again, something very, or let's say more active, like queen e8 was needed. And after b3, b5, this was the way to hold this position. Even if in the remaining endgame it's still unpleasant, the black rook will have to come to a8 probably. He has to protect both f7 and a5. You don't really want to enter this kind of line, but still all holding probably. Instead of queen e8, he played g6, as we said. b3, just protecting the pawn on a4, so there is no longer ideas like queen e8. h5, king h2, improving the king, king g7. And with the king here, it's more easy now to with white to go with queen d4, because there is a pin on the knight on f6. He can't move the knight, so you can't really do much. He played rook to d8, sorry, queen b2, and he's intending rook to c7. That's why he played queen b8. Instead, rook c8 was playable, of course, intending to trade both rooks. But after rook c4, the endgame is so hard to play. So the threat is knight d7 with a pin, winning. Takes with the pawn, and then queen b5 or queen b6 is coming. And you can also try to trade knights, for example, but you can't protect both f7, b7, a5. It's just too much. So knight d7, he has to give up a pawn. And the good thing is in this endgame is that there is no real way for the black queen to get any kind of a perpetual. Strangely enough, the king on g2 will be extremely safe, because there is no check on g4 or g5. So these squares are protected, so black can't really do any perpetual check. So it should be fine for white to win. He will place the queen on b6, play a5, put a lot of pressure on b7, and probably at the end try something like c5, c6, giving up the pawn, and then a6. Probably going to queen in the end for white. So this is a safe extra pawn and probably winning position for white. So that's why he played queen b8, and b4 was played. Probably queen c3 was hopeless for black immediately, because there is no way to avoid both knight d7. There are many threats depending on what you're doing. So if you defend the pawn on a5, for example, by playing queen e8, then queen c7, you have to defend the other pawn, and then rook g1 is the new threat in the position, because you can take on g6, the pawn on f7 is pinned, and after king g8 takes, and it's impossible to take back because it's going to be mate. So game over, and Anish wins. But still, he played something probably less strong than queen c3, but probably also winning. He played b4. So takes, and rook to c4. He is willing to invade the b file with both heavy piece by taking on b4. So b3 is willing to make the queen move. No, so if it leaves the square on b2, it's no longer pinning the knight on f6. But of course, Anish is just bringing the rook to b4, just willing to take back on b3 with the rook, and Wang Hao played queen a7, which was definitely losing now. He should have played one last try, one last attempt, the move queen d6, because, for example, there is some crazy save after rook takes b7, attacking f7. It looks very strong, but there is queen d2, and suddenly the position is equal. Queen takes, rook takes, so it's winning a piece, but at the end we are going to promote. So takes, king here, b2, and it's impossible to prevent the promotion. Maybe something that he may have missed is that if he goes b2 immediately, then takes on g6, king moves, and rook to g1 is winning for white. So this would be winning, but because the pawn on b2 is stopped. But after rook takes b2, there is no longer this possibility. The king has to come somewhere. The king comes to g3, and then b2 is unstoppable for the promotion. So something like taking every pawn, intending to take the rook on the next move. But I think the safest draw for black is to give up the queen, and then simply take the pawn on a5, and it should be an easy draw. Not necessarily easy, but it is a draw. Still, queen d6 was the best try, but after queen takes b3, probably it's still an extra pawn for white. but with some danger sometimes for white. He has to be cautious about the pawn on f2. He has to go queen b2, and there is still drawing chances for black. Maybe it's losing, but there are definitely drawing chances. So queen d6 was the last attempt. Instead, he played queen a7, and this is lost after rook takes b3, taking on b7. So the material is still equal, but f7 is lost for sure. He has no way to prevent it. After rook f8, there is a simple winning move, knight to d7, both attacking the both attacking the rook and the knight on f6, which is impossible to defend. So instead, queen e8, more or less hoping for taking on f7, because there might be some fortresses in this endgame. It's quite unlikely to be a draw, objectively, but still Anish would have been forced to prove his technique in this endgame. Instead, he's just improving his position on the 7th rank. Rook to d5, queen b7, it's impossible to prevent knight takes f7, and he eventually resigned. So quite a smooth win by Anish Giri. So he is now only half a point behind Jan Nepomniachtchi, so he definitely has his chances for the race for the candidates this year. So it will be so interesting. And for Wang Hao, of course, he is now quite far from the head of the tournament, so probably less interesting rest of the tournament, but still a lot of interesting games to come. And see you tomorrow for the round number 10.